Hello and welcome to my Victober wrap-up video. So this year I decided to join in again for Victober, and this is one of my favorite readathons of all year. I am always so inspired by the hosts and their passion and dedication to Victorian literature and to figuring out creative ways to make it more accessible to everyone. And so I just wanted to share kind of my experiences, what I chose for each prompt and my thoughts on that. And so the first thing that I'm going to start with is poetry. So the prompt was to read Victorian poetry, and I chose the collected poems of Thomas Hardy. And what I chose to do was to read one poem a day. And so I have read 31 poems, and I just wanted to share a couple of my favorites. The Darkling Thrush is one that is very famous of his, possibly the most famous, and I did really enjoy that one. I also loved The Haunter, and I also loved The Later Autumn. So I felt like for reading poetry during Victober, I was really drawn to kind of those haunting, atmospheric poems. He also has a set of Casterbridge fair poems as well, which of course links to The Mayor of Casterbridge, which is the novel that he wrote that was also the buddy read for this Victober, and I will get into that book a little bit later. But there is a tie to it in this collected poems anthology. So my favorite parts about Thomas Hardy poetry is that he really does, just as he does in his novels, he's able to access life in a way that a lot of poets don't. He is humorous and sarcastic and creative, and I've not ever read any of his poetry, so I really appreciated the opportunity to every day start my day with some of his writing. So next, the prompt is to read a short story. And originally I had thought of reading a G.K. Chesterton tale, and I actually did. And the one I chose was Christmas themed, which I loved. But since Chesterton is not officially a Victorian writer, I felt a little bit like I was cheating. And so I went ahead and read the Canterville Ghost by Oscar Wilde. I really loved this story. I would say that it is my favorite Oscar Wilde, which I realize there's a lot of Oscar Wilde stories. The Happy Prince I've read The Picture of Dorian Gray, but there's always sort of this weight to that writing, and the Canterville Ghost, while there is some weight to it, I just felt a lightness and a humor to his writing that I really reveled in. And I had originally chosen that short story to read and then watch the movie adaptation because that's another prompt in Victober. And I went ahead and watched the movie adaptation that is from, I think, the late 1990s. It has Patrick Stewart and it has Neve Campbell. So this follows the story of Simon, who is a ghost who is haunting the Canterville mansion. And an American family moves in, and the ghost has met his match. They are not having it. And in the short story, their kind of abrasive callousness, which is a typical kind of American characteristic to portray, this ghost is not able to haunt them like he had. He went through his whole list of all the other people that he was able to haunt successfully, and this family was not one of them. Well, within this story, there is a prophecy, and this prophecy relies on a young girl to be able to help save Simon from himself and from the hauntings that he is doing. And so without giving too much away, I will say the movie followed fairly close to the short story. Patrick Stewart was phenomenal. I love him as an actor, and just really that the movie version that I watched, if it had been anyone else, I would not have enjoyed it. Neve Campbell was not my favorite in that role, but because of Patrick Stewart, it just was such a great adaptation of it. I will say the father is more preferable in the short story. He really was a cad in the movie, and I didn't like that part, that kind of how they pulled that in and made that part of the storyline. But it's just so very humorous, and in fact I felt like the movie was less humorous than the short story, which I realize is a little bit surprising with Oscar Wilde because he had such a tragic end of his life with going to prison and all of that. I just really think of him as being very heavy, and this was a side of him that I was not familiar with. So for the next prompt, it was to read a novel and watch a movie adaptation. And since I used Canterville Ghost as the short story, I wanted to really follow along with the prompts, and I chose Persuasion. So this was kind of a surprise mood read for me. I wasn't planning on reading this, but it is my favorite Jane Austen, and I watched the 2022 Persuasion on Netflix. So as an older woman, I just really have, as time has gone on, found more and more appreciation for Persuasion. It was not my favorite Jane Austen when I was younger, but it is now. And I have watched a few different adaptations and movies of this novel, and the one from the 90s is my favorite. I will say the Netflix 2022 version I don't think is very popular. I think it gets pretty scathing reviews, but I actually enjoyed it. My biggest complaint is that for me, Captain Wentworth needs to be a certain kind of character. And in the 1995 movie, he is that. In this movie, Wentworth is not as strong of a character as he should be, in my opinion. And in this adaptation, Anne Elliot has a just as vain of a father, and her two sisters are, Mary is played phenomenally, and Elizabeth, she probably could have been a better character, but she wasn't terrible. And this Anne Elliot, she looks directly at the camera to turn and kind of have side commentary, and she's a pretty strong character. In the book, Anne kind of does some self-talking to help her make it through some pretty difficult situations, and this Anne Elliot does not do that. But she is still kind of awkward, but mousy is not a word that I would use for the 2022 movie version. She's very well-spoken and opinionated. I also really loved the friendship that she had with Louisa Musgrove, which is not really in the book to that extent. She also had a pretty good relationship with Lady Russell, and I will say, after watching the movie, I really now would hope that the maliciousness that is sometimes seen in Lady Russell's behavior maybe wasn't so malicious, and that Louisa really was kind of innocent in all of this and really did esteem Anne and didn't want her to be hurt, which is why she, without giving too much away, why the book ended the way that it ended. So I would say, to give the Netflix 2022 Persuasion a chance, and hopefully you'll like it. Leave in the comments below whether you like it or not if you've seen it. I'm just curious. Okay, so next, Kate Howe's prompt was to find a Victorian novel that has a character that has a chronic illness or a disability. And I chose The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins. I will say, I really have been wanting to read this and just figured out a way to make this work. This story follows the theft of the Moonstone all the way from India to England. It is an epistolary novel because it has diary entries in it. Basically, it's like a journal that is kind of passed along multiple characters so that we are able to figure out what happened to the Moonstone once it was in England, because very shortly into this, it goes missing and you're kind of following where it is. I will say the disability part of this, while it is in there, there are two characters actually, from what I can tell, who have a disability. One of the characters, who's a pretty main character, has a back injury, and then another character has a crutch and she has to use that to be able to ambulate. And it is mentioned specifically, but it's not really plainly evident. You know, I've read books where you have characters with disabilities in them and chronic illness, and it becomes a pretty strong plot line. And in this, their disability does affect them, but it's not explicitly explained how it affects them. You're just led to understand that these certain characters make certain decisions because their disability has kind of affected them, if that makes any sense, mentally. A couple things that I liked about this book is that it is humorous. There is a section here, let me read it with my tab. It says, "We had our breakfasts. Whatever happens in a house, robbery or murder, it doesn't matter. You must have your breakfast." So just little quips like that. One of the main characters loves Robinson Crusoe so much that it's almost like his Bible. Like, he quotes it and always reads it and wants to read it for comfort. And that's very humorous as well. I liked the underlying thoughts on Christianity in here. So one of the characters says, "Note here, I'm an average good Christian when you don't push my Christianity too far. And all the rest of you, which is a great comfort, are in this respect much the same as I am." So there's little digs and comments in here about Christianity, and not in a way that puts it down, but it just makes you think about its involvement and kind of human fallacy and how that's all tied up into our Christianity. What I didn't necessarily like about this book is, first of all, there's a trigger warning for suicide, which I was not aware of when I opened this. And it's also very Anglo-centric. So one of the main characters, Mr. Franklin Blake, has traveled all across Europe specifically. And there are comments in there about how his involvement with other cultures has affected him in odd ways. And so, again, I don't know if that's commentary. I don't know Wilkie Collins enough to know if that's commentary that was common in that time and he was being sarcastic and making fun of it, or if it actually was a thread through there to just kind of say, like, hey, England is the standard by which all others are measured. And then with the whole fact that the Moonstone was stolen from India and the characters from India that are portrayed in the book, it just, again, feels like anyone from foreign countries, not England, or anyone who has traveled and been exposed to other cultures is potentially someone to be mistrusted, someone who may be manipulative or a little bit mad, basically. So, but all in all, on the whole, I did enjoy this, and it is touted as possibly the first detective story, and I thought it was well done. I do feel like I knew who the culprit was pretty early on, but there were definitely points then where I doubted myself and was like, well, maybe I'm off completely. At one point, I wasn't sure if I could trust the narrator, if this was like an unreliable narrator, especially since there were so many of them, but some of the main ones that I was really believing in and trusting in because I like their personality. And then I started to think, well, maybe I can't trust them. So it's definitely a ride and one that I would recommend. So for the prompt of a Bildungsroman, which is basically a tale of a character who goes through growth, I chose The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Bronte. I just think this copy is so gorgeous. I splurged and included this in a birthday wish list. This is also an epistolary novel. It is told through letters and diaries. It starts out with the main character, Gilbert, who is a young man who has lost his father. He is the head now of the household of a mother, a sister, and a brother. Because he's the oldest, he's the one who is now in charge of the estate and the property. And it comes to his attention that there is a new tenant at Wildfell Hall, which is in his area, and that is Mrs. Helen Graham, and she has come by having a very mysterious background. She and her son have shown up into their community with this kind of mysterious, murky background. So this is my first Bronte novel that I have read, and apparently I've done a little bit of research on it because I found myself wondering why, when I was in high school, we just read so much of Charlotte Bronte and Emily Bronte. Why hadn't I heard of Anne Bronte's writings? Like, I don't remember them being published. And it turns out that it's a fairly new revelation for her works to be published. Charlotte apparently really buried her works, especially this one, from what I understand. There is some thought that there's a character in here that is just, I mean, evil is probably a good word to describe him. He is an alcoholic. He incites others around him to just live debaucherous lives. And so there's thought that Charlotte kind of thought, especially after Anne had passed away, that this character was based on Branwell, who was their brother, who really did struggle with addiction. And so this was really kind of seemed to be buried. I cannot state clear enough how much I loved this tale. Again, I wanted to keep going and figure out the mystery of how Helen and her son Arthur ended up where they ended up. When I went into it, I thought it was Gilbert's story and was just so happy when Helen handed over her diary to Gilbert to read, to figure out what it is that brought her to where she is. Anne is somebody who definitely went through so much growth as a young, impetuous woman to the mother that she ends the novel as. Gilbert also went through so much growth. There were other characters that went, this felt like such a perfect book to read for the Bildungsroman prompt. So if you read this, I would love to hear in the comments below what you think of it. And it's just phenomenal. So I read this at the same time that I read the buddy read, which was The Mayor of Casterbridge by Thomas Hardy. This follows Michael Henchard. He shows up in town with his wife Susan and his little daughter Elizabeth Jane. And right at the very beginning, in the beginning of the book, he has some furmity, which is porridge, and I guess they put rum in this porridge, and he had way too much rum, and he sold his wife and his daughter to a traveling sailor who was just passing through. And Susan, the wife, Thomas Hardy really portrays her as someone who is not very bright, doesn't really understand that a husband can't do that. And so she leaves with him, and Michael Henchard then spends the rest of his life with a promise of sobriety, and that he's going to try to make up for this bad choice that he made. So this really delves into the concept of self-worth and how much you are worth not only to others but to yourself. I mean, there were definitely twists in this where I was like, I cannot believe that Thomas Hardy just had that happen. I will say this. There are some people that are really offended that he sold his wife, and that's like a big turnoff. I managed to, in a little free library, get this version that offers this huge section in the back of notes on this novel and explaining kind of the different iterations and what was going on in Thomas Hardy's time. He saw an ad, at least one, if not more, of a husband offering to sell his wife in the newspaper. And so when he saw that, it in his mind lit this idea of a story of, well, what if that actually happened? I will say, reading the two of these together was so intriguing because you have in one novel a woman who is sold, who is forced to leave her marriage. And you have in this one a woman who makes the choice to leave. I have been saying to my husband, I would love to write a paper to compare and contrast these two novels. It just was very intriguing to read the two of these together to see how women were portrayed in both of them. Knowing that Anne Bronte was a female who very much seemed to appreciate a strong female character. And Thomas Hardy was, in my estimation, a man who was a feminist, who really saw how women were treated and saw the unfairness of that and tried to explain what that looks like in the lives of the people that are in Casterbridge. So both phenomenal. I loved this as a buddy read. I'm so glad I read it, and I loved Victober. So as I've said, I really loved Victober this year, and I would love to hear if you've read any of the books that I've shared or seen any of the movies and have thoughts about them, or want to share some of your favorite reads or movies from this year's Victober or even in the past. Feel free to leave those in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching. Until next time.